is supposed to be doing that? But KG's not here, so who is assigned?
Dan, he's ran off.
Because you have to go in the back room and get it on Facebook or something. You
Yeah,
turn on.
Dan's doing it,
Did Dan do that?
but I don't know where he went.
Yeah.
To go get something.
Does he maybe think he just is supposed to do the mic?
No.
Because I think there's something in the back they have to push.
No, he's got it.
I apologize for being slow here. I didn't know we wouldn't have it tech set up, so we'll have it shortly, I hope.
So is the HDMI plugged in to both?
Appears to be, I mean, I got an HDMI coming in here.
Maybe unplug it and replug it.
Hey, Steph.
Stephanie's not here, is she?
Well, she's getting it hooked up on her computer, but it's not going onto the screen. KG is so we don't know what we have to do in the back to push the button to make it work, so nobody can watch the screen. It says no network.
How would that work? Touch on button. Is that where you work?
Is there audio with it? Is there audio with it?
Picky. Hey, while we're messing with this technology stuff, I'm going to kill a little moment here and just remind you, we got this event coming up at the church this Friday night. It is a jazz lecture, a lecture by a guy that wrote a book called Thriving on a Riff, which is a book about spirituality, Christian spirituality, and the history of jazz. This guy, his name is Bill Carter. He wrote this book, and he has been in our church before with his whole band. He's a jazz musician and a Presbyterian pastor. So he's going to give this talk on this book. It's free. It's at 7 o'clock over in the sanctuary. But what's kind of cool is he's also going to play the piano a little bit. He's got some jazz standards that he'll use to make the point when he's talking, and then also some of his own stuff. And so we're going to have a blast. He calls it a jazz hootenanny. So we'll just have this talk. We'll have some conversation. We'll sell the book. We'll have some refreshments. It's all free. It'll be cool. So if you know, in more way than one, it's going to be cool. So if you want to be somewhere Friday night, come and join us at the church at 7 o'clock. Thanks a million. And here is Emily Clark.
Good morning, everybody. I'm feeling a little more stressed than I expected to be feeling as I start. Like, who knew that would be a problem? But anyway, here we are. Good morning. And as Byron said, I'm Emily Clark. I am a member of the Adult Christian Ed Committee here. I'm also trained as a spiritual director, which means that I live in the world of, as Kyle preached on this morning, contemplation and spiritual practices. It's something I'm deeply interested in and have found to be very life-giving and life-changing. So I'm really honored to be here having the chance to instruct today. We are in the 5th of 8 weeks of a course offered by an organization called PracticingTheWay.org, largely driven by the work by a wonderful author and preacher named John Mark Comer. This is the book that he has written on this topic. But this is the outcome of years and years of writing and thinking that he has done, and a lot of this work is also expressed in a number of other places that are available to you. You can go to practicingtheway.org, and actually, if you want to follow along this course a little more closely, if you reach out to Stephanie, she can get you into the course materials. But also at practicingtheway.org, or Practicing the Way, they run a wonderful podcast that talks a lot about the same things in the book. And there's also another podcast out there called the John Mark Comer Teaching Podcast, where you get a lot of the sermons that John Mark Comer has done, where he just lives in this world and this life, and it's really very instructive. So I encourage you to explore. He's got a wonderful voice out there in this world of apprenticing to Jesus, and has a wonderful way of speaking and preaching that really I have found to be in a space that doesn't take us too far into any particular realm of positioning, either politically or spiritually or denominationally or whatever. He's able to really broach it beautifully. So I really encourage you to check him out. So 2 things today. First of all, we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about last week's lesson, which was on Sabbath. And then we're going to move forward into this week's lesson, which, strangely enough and challenging as it sounds, is meeting God in pain and suffering. So aren't you glad you came? So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about Sabbath. I am really taken when I listen to John Mark Comer's teaching and how he makes this very important point that the practices are not about the practices themselves. And actually, I was just reading the book last night, and he makes the point of saying that when we get into the world of trying to be all perfectionistic about the practices, we're actually just taking control in a whole nother way, which isn't what we want to be doing. The point of the practices is to enable us to enter the realm of God's love. And the desired outcome of doing the practices is that you will notice yourself becoming more loving and functioning in the world as a more loving individual. I'd also like to invite another aspect that I've noticed is here, but sometimes is a little bit more subtly touched upon, and that is, if you remember last week in the video, June Willard was speaking about a moment that she had where she was listening to some music, and she had this moment where she became very aware that God was talking to her about being beloved, and I wanted to encourage us as we're thinking about these practices, that the other thing that is happening here is that we are slowing down and allowing ourselves to not only be formed to be more loving, but be shaped to be more aware of God's presence and God's love and God's love for us. As we engage in these things where we are being encouraged to take these times of silence, and if you haven't heard today's sermon yet, you'll be pleased to know, consistently with what we're talking about, the world of contemplation, where we're attempting to praise God, be in God's presence, that God is on the other end of the line. I've told this story when I taught another class about Jim Schofield, who many of you know from this church, who told us in a Bible study once that he thinks that when we take time to be with God, it's a little bit like when he phones home and would phone home and his dad would answer the phone and say, "Honey, Jim's on the line." And it was this moment of great joy for the father that his child was checking in. So when we slow down and take these moments of contemplation, when we sit quietly with God, when we pray and try and move ourselves out of this headspace where we're controlling and making things happen and into a space of rest and peacefulness, that God is meeting us there and is so pleased that you have taken the time to join and be in this relationship in a way that really we can only achieve when we have a dear one that we want to be in one-on-one time with, taking that time away. So I encourage you, as you think about all of these practices, that this is what we're doing. We're not only training ourselves to be more loving or hoping that we're putting ourselves in a space where we will become more loving, but we're also really coming into connection with how loved we are and how much God wants us to be in a place of wholeness and understanding of who we are in his eyes. So let's go a little bit to the idea of Sabbath. I'm going to tell a little story, and then we'll talk about whether you guys had a chance to contemplate Sabbath in the last week, since you went from a Sabbath to a Sabbath, and I'm sure you haven't really thought about taking a 24-hour Sabbath on a Sunday. But I was doing some teaching last year, and we were talking about retreat. So this is, retreat being maybe a part day, a whole day, or even a longer length of time. But I was sharing a story that comes out of our family where my daughter, Allison, who is a force of nature, those of you who know her, got it in her head that she wanted to start a tradition called Daddy Alley Day, and that she felt that there should be an annual event where she and her father went off, and like, she's with me all the time, right? So mom Allie doesn't, whatever, but Daddy Alley Day, dad's off at work, dad travels, dad's gone a lot, that she wanted to establish a time to be with her father. So working and looking at schedules, we chose a day when Chris could afford to take some time away from work and Allison could afford to take some time off school, and we signed her out of school, and they made a plan. We were living in Chicago at the time, and we said to Allison, Chris said to Allison, what do you want to do with your day? And more than anything, she wanted to go to the Museum of Natural History in Chicago and see this dinosaur called Sue, who had been uncovered in recent years, the largest Tyrannosaurus rex fossilized skeleton in the world, and this was her desire. And so they made this plan that this is what they're going to do. They're going to go to downtown Chicago. And when I was preparing the lesson, I called Allison up and I said, Allison, what are your memories of that day? And she said, I love the fact that I was going to have a day where I didn't have anything I had to do. I didn't have to go to school. I didn't have to do what my brothers wanted to do. I could just rest and be with my father and go and have this fun adventure. I'm sorry, this makes me choked up, this story. So when I talked to Chris about it in preparation for this teaching, I said, Chris, what's your memory of the day? And he said, there was so much joy and anticipation in planning with her what we were going to do together. And when we had the day together, yes, it was fun to go see Sue, but it was also fun to walk by the shores of Lake Michigan and just soak in the beautiful sunshine and soak in being with my daughter and soak in the fact that my daughter wanted to be with me. So I think about this and I think this is God when we think about our Sabbath. That we're saying, God, I want to have a day with you. And I'm going to take a day and make it a restful day where I don't have to be doing anything I don't want to do. And God is saying, let's plan it together. Let's have a day together and go and enjoy and be in the world and just connect for this day. And that's what God wants for us when we think about Sabbath. So sometimes it's really hard to pull away, but when we think of the longing of the Father for us, it becomes a little easier to do. So I'm sorry for sobbing all over the place here, but I'd like to talk about what you thought about Sabbath in the last week as you contemplated this idea of, can you afford a few hours or a half day or a part day someday during the week, even if it's not Sunday? Maybe Friday evenings become a special time in your house where you're done with work and you're going to take this time off and have this time of rest. Maybe it's a Sunday. Kyle, I doubt you can take a Sabbath on a Sunday. I'm sure you have a different day that you take that time off. But I'd love to hear what you're thinking about Sabbath. I don't know whether you have had it, in 1 week's time, I'm sure you didn't have a chance to take a Sabbath, but have you experienced Sabbath? Do you make a habit of Sabbath? Does anyone have it as a practice in their life? And I will listen to what you say and try and repeat, because I think, are we being broadcast? Do we know? Yes, okay. So does anybody have any thoughts on Sabbath before we go forward? Yes.
At the senior living facility where Mom lives, there's this wonderful building
That is so beautiful. A story about being able to be with a loved one in a quiet place at a nursing home where they take the residents outside and they sit in a beautiful place in nature and just have this time of quiet or maybe connectedness that just is happening for an hour at a time during the week. That's beautiful. Thank you. Does anybody else have any thoughts on how they hope to do Sabbath or have had experience with Sabbath? Yes.
This may sound strange, but I did not get to see Memorial Day show that they put on down in DC. So Friday I finally just relaxed and watched it, and it was so meaningful. The individual stories of an older man, a young girl, and another one of their time in war and their service and how they've overcome it. And with the young girl, she felt guilty because even though she lost a leg and her mouth was all messed up, she felt her purpose of being in the service was gone. What was her purpose? And she talked, a stranger came to her and says, "Would you like to snowboard?" Now she has an artificial leg, had to learn to walk. And the fact that he said that to her got her back into living. She did snowboarding. She's climbed every peak in Mount Everest, all the mountain peaks. And she said her purpose now is to live and enjoy life for those in the service who died young and can't live their life. And that's how she now took away her guilt of survival. And just the whole experience, it made me feel so good just to see their stories and hear their songs they sang. It was the Memorial Day concert on PBS, but I taped it and I finally took time just to sit and enjoy it.
You gave yourself permission to stop and do something that was very life-giving to you. Linda was sharing a story about choosing to take time to watch a recording she'd made of the Memorial Day concert down in Washington, D.C., and how life-giving it was to her that she gave herself this gift to take the time out and enjoy something that she was really delighting in and wanting to do, the meaningfulness of those stories. Any other reflections on Sabbath? Taking time away to be with God? Yes. Beth.
I think the most significant thing I learned about Sabbath is I don't do it well. And, living alone, I have time for it. It's not like I've got such a busy schedule that I can't possibly take time apart. But I did discover that when Christian music comes on, that's a Sabbath for me. I can stop everything I'm doing or thinking and just enjoy the music. I really do connect with God through music a lot. So.
What's beautiful to that, Betty was sharing how she's discovered that it's not so much finding the time for Sabbath, but the attitude for Sabbath. Is that a fair way to put it? And that by listening to Christian music, she's found an avenue into a place where she can feel that Sabbath delight and rest. And I want to add commentary to that one of the things I think is important for us to recognize is that these practices, and I think John Mark Comer touched on this, or one of the speakers at the end last week, that the practices can be these sort of structured things that we're offering you, but you can also find your own way into practice, and it might be listening to Christian music, but it also might be being out in your garden, or I think he even mentioned folding laundry, that these moments where we think about God and we spend time being with God can be these times of contemplation and practice, as well as these more structured prayer and Sabbath and things that we're naming in this course. Linda.
Another aspect I forgot to tell you is when this girl was in the hospital, I mean, she had to have 40-some surgeries on her mouth and her leg. She had about 20 of her servicemen kneeled in prayer around her bed. She woke up and found them kneeling in prayer around her bed. So it was heartful to hear that they pray.
That's powerful. The power of prayer. It's another practice. You had something to say.
Yeah, well, this week I went back and took a look at the Jewish Sabbath on Friday night prayer. it's giving thanks that what God gives us bread of life, gives us the wine. So it gets us, into an appreciation mode, thinking about what God has given to us. And then I started going, you know what? This is kind of like communion. You know, even now, when we do communion, it's almost the same as celebrating Sabbath.
What a joyful discovery. We were hearing about a little research that was done last week about what the Jewish Sabbath looked like on Friday night and the prayers that they have for bread and wine, and a connection made between that and our communion, and how this idea of Sabbath is so closely tied to faith traditions across the board. It's beautiful. Anybody else? I saw a hand. Yes, please.
I often get up early in the morning. I start my day about 5:30. Professor helps get up, and I'll take that time to go out in the courtyard and just kind of just watch the sunrise and have a moment of like contemplation before I work out. This morning, I really felt connected. This morning, I usually work out in the courtyard, and as I'm laying back on the weight bench, there's a small rainbow in the sky, like right over top of me. It's like
There you go. A story about a gentleman who makes a habit of getting up at 5:30 every morning and taking a little time outside in the courtyard. And this morning there was a rainbow, which just one of those things. You know it's happening. All right, I think unless anybody has something they really would like to say, I'd like to move into the next part of our lesson. Our next, yes, Byron.
I just want to say that one of the things that struck me in the video last week
Please.
was he did some things with friends, and they light a candle. There's sort of this ritual when their Sabbath begins. So although I really affirm our own sort of episodes of finding God here and there, he was pushing us towards this sort of moving towards a 24 hours where you sort of start at light a candle and begin. And I'm not there yet, although most people know I work from home, our business and our house is right there. And most of our business these days is mail order. And I made a decision years ago that I just wasn't going to do any email on Sunday because I just live, late into the night. I'm online all the time, talking to people and emailing. And I just don't do it on Sunday because the scripture says don't work on Sunday. So that's been a big decision for me, but it isn't very fun because I like doing it. So I'm fighting it every single week. It's like, well, what? I should go back to work. Oh, God says don't work on Sunday. But this idea of kind of starting with a candle and with friends and a meal, that was when he showed that video of his friends. I'm like, man, I'd like to be there.
You
They're drinking wine, eating food, and lighting candles. I thought, oh, that would be a good way to do every Friday night. So anyway, that he showed this sort of celebration, but also a ritual to begin something every
Yes.
single week.
Yes, and there is writing in the world. And Byron was speaking about what sparked him was watching the video last week and the ritual that John Mark Comer showed at the beginning of Sabbath, where they're lighting a candle and feasting together. And there's thought that we have been raised to think that Sabbath is this dull day of can't milk the cows or whatever. That we're required to not be doing anything and it's dull and boring. But God's intention for us on Sabbath was to have a day of delight, and it might be a day of fellowship and a day of what is life-giving to us. So the idea that something is pulling on you, Byron, it feels like an invitation is so beautiful. That as we're invited into Sabbath, what is our heart singing for? What is our desire? And perhaps it's a meal with friends in this symbolic beginning of a time that's holy and special. Just before we move out, in the materials for the course, if you happen to get into them, there's a on page. You guys don't have this. This is out here, but let me just read you interestingly what this course offers. Here's a short guide to planning your next Sabbath. When will you Sabbath? How will you mark the beginning and the end of your Sabbath time? What will you do with your devices? What do you need to do to prepare? How will you include friends and family? What will you do to fill your heart with joy and peace? How can you create Sabbath for those who have none? So if you're able to, if you ask Stephanie and get in the materials and go play around, but this is in the companion guide to the course some ideas about Sabbath. And I don't think that was in the handout last week, but it might have been. I don't know. All right, so we are really running out of time here. We're probably going to have just time to watch the video, and it's going to be time to wrap up. But meeting God in pain and suffering. As we open ourselves up to this world of prayer and contemplation, we may find ourselves challenged. Sometimes it's just a matter of feeling reluctance that I get into wanting to do this, and it's creating, I don't really know if I want to sit for this amount of time. This is hard to do. I have anxiety about what I'm leaving behind. But other times we find ourselves opening ourselves up to prayer, and really painful things surface. And Kyle did touch on this in the sermon today. When those of you who haven't heard it yet will hear it. He mentions that there are times when we enter these periods of contemplation and hard things come to us when we're still enough to shut the other nonsense out, to shut the world out. We find things underneath that are challenging. And that is what is addressed in the sermon today, in the video today. So I'm going to start that, and we'll have a little bit of time afterwards to chat about it.
In this world, you will face trouble. Suffering comes to find all of us. The loss of a loved one, cancer diagnosis, the breakdown of a relationship. And over time, emotional pain accumulates in our soul. We carry our history in our body and live our past in our present. And all too often, our unhealed emotional pain sabotages our spiritual formation into people of love. When pain and suffering come knocking on our door, what do we do? We left off last week with the practices of Jesus, ancient spiritual disciplines by which we open our life to God. Now, I love the practices, but let's shoot straight for a minute. Maybe your experience with the practices over the last few weeks was pure bliss. You felt close to Jesus and drawn into the Trinity's inner life of love. But maybe not. When I first started on this inner journey, there were times in prayer where I would experience something that was, for me at least, counterintuitive. But I realized later, very common. I went into it expecting to feel happy and peaceful, but instead I would often feel all sorts of emotional pain. I would find myself feeling anger at someone who hurt me in my past, or feeling anxiety over my future. I would find myself suffering from what psychologists call afflictive thoughts. If that was your experience, you are not alone. Often what happens in the practices is when we slow down and come to quiet before God, all our undigested emotional pain that we've pushed down in the busyness of life, it comes up from the shadow to the surface of our heart. The Cistercian monk Thomas Keating said that the first thing that comes up in quiet prayer is what he called the unloading of the unconscious. He writes, when we commit ourselves to the spiritual journey, the first thing the Spirit does is to start removing the emotional junk of a lifetime that is inside of us. When this happens, it does not mean that you're bad at the practices. This is all part of the process of spiritual formation. The practices are not a religious formula to habit stack our way to Christ-like character. Rather, the practices create time and space for the unprocessed emotional pain of a lifetime, from our childhood wounds from 20 years ago to a passing slight from a coworker the day before, to come out of the shadows and into the light where they can be healed. In the therapy world, they call emotional pain a search of healing. Think about the role of pain in the body. When you get hurt, pain is kind of your body's way of getting you to key in on a part of you in need of attention, healing, and love. The pain is a signal to your mind something is wrong in your body and in need of healing. Emotional pain is very similar. It's often a signal from our soul that some aspect of our person is in need of attention, healing, and love. The problem is, the modern world does not know how to deal with pain. There are three common cultural responses to emotional pain. The first is to deny. You just deny that you have pain. This is the most popular response in a lot of Christian circles because it's so easy for us to spiritualize our denial as faith in God. The psychologist John Wellwood called this spiritual bypassing, which he defined as a tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. It is a futile attempt to co-opt the Christian theology of hope to skip over our pain and chase the Western life script up and to the right. The thing about denial is, it works incredibly well. It is the most effective of all coping strategies. The problem is, it's a short-term strategy, and it's incredibly dangerous. Think of physical pain. If you get hurt and it's not dangerous, your body will likely self-heal. Just give it a few days or weeks. But if you have a pain in your body that won't go away, it's highly likely that something is seriously wrong. And if you deny it, or ignore it, or pretend it's not real, it could grow and damage you, or even kill you long term. Sigmund Freud was wrong about almost everything, but he was right that whatever we refuse to face in our inner lives has the most power over us. Denying any part of our inner life, especially those parts that are in need of a healing touch, always has destructive consequences on us and on others. The second option is you detach. You emotionally disconnect from your feelings. Certain personality types seem to have the ability to cut off their emotional pain. But if we cut off our emotional pain, we inadvertently cut ourselves off to the whole spectrum of emotion, lows and highs. We don't feel sadness, but neither do we feel joy or wonder or gratitude. Of course, the most popular way people deal with their pain is to drug it. Many people literally drug their pain with alcohol or cannabis or pain meds, but most of us drug our pain more figuratively with our cultural narcotic of choice. It could be work or our career, or sex, or romance, or social media, or entertainment, TV and film and video games. It could be anything that is used as a distraction from our pain and our God, rather than a pathway through our pain to God. When we turn to drugs, either literally or figuratively, we feel a momentary relief from our pain, but ultimately we make our anxiety or sadness worse, not better. But none of these ways of dealing with emotional pain are the Jesus way. The Jesus way is to meet God in our pain. What does the Jesus way look like? Let's read from Matthew 26, which is arguably the most painful moment in Jesus' life. It's the night before the cross, when he's feeling the weight of what's coming. Judas' betrayal, his best friend's denial, his disciples' abandonment, his coming rejection, humiliation, torture, brutal death. What does he do? Does he deny it? It's okay, God has a plan, other people have it way worse. No. Does he detach? It is what it is. No. Does he drug? Hey guys, let's go out for one last night on the town. No. He goes to a quiet place with his closest friends that he can share anything with. And then we read this. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Notice the line, he began to be sorrowful. Jesus intentionally makes space for all of his feelings of sadness to come up, and he meets God in his pain by offering his feelings up to God in prayer. This practice, what has come to be called lament, is a key feature of what the pastor Pete Scazzero calls emotionally healthy spirituality. Scazzero's thesis is that it is impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. But emotional health doesn't mean you are happy all the time. Jesus was the most emotionally healthy person to ever live. And in Luke's version of the story we just read, Jesus begins to sweat blood, a medical condition called hematohydrosis, which is brought on by extreme duress. Emotional health means, one, you are aware of your feelings. You have the capacity to notice and name your inner life in a spirit of welcome and gentleness. And two, you are not run by your feelings. You have the capacity to sit with your feelings and let your body process them before God in prayer without them causing you to behave in unloving ways. Psychologists call this emotional regulation, and the New Testament calls it self-control. But to become emotionally healthy means we have to go on the inner journey, as some call it, to meet God in our pain. We have to learn how to pray our pain to God and share our pain with each other. This is why so many find therapy to be a key part of the inner journey. Processing our pain with an older, wiser, loving soul can be deeply healing. But through practices like silence and solitude, prayer, and therapy and friendship, we make time and space to process our pain and suffering with God and our community. This is often a slow, painful process, but it is the crucible of our formation. Pain and suffering are inevitable in life. Again, Jesus said, "In this world you will face trouble," not may, but will. There is no version of your life where you do not feel emotional pain. The Jesus we follow was himself betrayed, abandoned, falsely accused, unjustly treated, and murdered. The prophet Isaiah called him a man of suffering and familiar with pain. The writer of Hebrews said, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are." And while few of us have ever experienced the level of trauma that Jesus did, we have all been hurt, wounded, and thrown into trials and tribulations. Left unhealed, the unresolved emotional pain of a lifetime will sabotage our spiritual formation into people of love. If we allow hurt and anger and bitterness and fear to fester in our soul, it will undermine our best intentions to become like Jesus. Hurt people, as the saying goes. Psychologists give us categories like trauma, attachment, emotional triggers, and more to name the unhealthy patterns that arise from pain and suffering, and in turn ruin relationships and block our transformation. But there is good news. Jesus went on to say, "Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." Because of Jesus' incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, no pain and suffering is meaningless as it is in a secular worldview, because death and all his friends have been overcome by Jesus, which means the very pain and suffering that can sabotage our spiritual formation can become the secret to our spiritual formation. Our breakdowns can become our breakthroughs. The risen Christ has the face trials of many kinds because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Peter adds this, for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Do you see it? The very pain that we all want to deny or detach from or drug is the pathway to our transformation. If we, like Jesus, will only meet God in our pain.
So that was a lot. And I'm sure for some of you in the room that brought up some things maybe. What's comforting is to know that our Lord Jesus understands it all and wants to be with us in it. And can redeem it. So we have, if I were to end on time, really only less than 5 minutes. What I'd like to do is bring your attention to the little booklet where there are some discussion questions. Byron, can I run over even though the video will be done at 9:30, or do I need to just... Okay. So the discussion questions on... my numbering has page 68 at the bottom of it. I don't know if yours, but they are: number 1, can you tell one story of a painful experience that you've been through that has been used for good in your formation? Number 2, how have you experienced God in times of pain and suffering? Number 3, which of these 3 responses to emotional pain are you most inclined toward? Deny, detach, or drug? What has that looked like in your life? And number 4, what could it look like for you to reorient yourself to the pain in your life as an opportunity to be formed by God? And how blessed we are to be in this room where we can talk about the fact that life is hard and we experience hard things and we have pain and we mess up, and yet we have this God who sent his Son, who loves us and wants us to be whole and to come through this in a way that draws us closer. I think what I'd love to do is just give you an opportunity for like 2 minutes to turn to somebody near to you and just reflect quickly on whether any of these questions are zinging at your heart right now in some way, that you have something you'd like to say. This is just a gentle invitation. There's no obligation here. But if there's anything in either of these 4 questions that offers you an invitation, let's just take a couple minutes and then we'll have an opportunity to wrap up together. And if the video needs to end because it's 9:30, then love you all out there and hope you'll come and join us next week. So please go ahead right now. Just find somebody nearby and just share with them if there's anything in these questions that might I know you're all having really meaningful and deep conversation, but I'm sorry that the time is short here and that I'm going to ask you to cease for a moment. Is there anyone that just has something that they really feel like they'd like to say about what you saw or what you talked about just now?